You're listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Welcome to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology Podcast. Thank you for joining me on my pilot episode. My name is Robert Walker, and to first give you a little introduction about myself, I started role-playing in 1997 with Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition. I did that for a few years until 2000 when 3rd Edition released, and we very quickly jumped ship. Stuck with 3rd Edition for the better part of my adult life. We have recently switched to Pathfinder after dabbling in 4th Edition for a little bit of time, and as many of you realize who play Pathfinder, 4th Edition is not exactly what we all wanted. There are some great things from it that I've definitely stolen for many of my campaigns, as I assume many of you have done out there as well. In 2020, I returned to college and finished an associate's degree in psychology, and I will be graduating in June of this year with my bachelor's in psychology and going into a Master's of Science in Industrial Organizational Psychology starting in July. I also published a book last month. It is titled Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System, and I started this podcast because I wanted to continue to give back to the gaming community that has given me so much. So let me tell you a little bit about what this podcast will be. What you can expect from this podcast is discussion of tabletop role-playing games of all systems, including tricks, tips, and off-the-wall concepts to add into your game, and also a look at the psychology of roleplay, the psychology of human interaction, and how psychology can help you better understand your players around the table and help you build more interesting campaigns and write more interesting stories. Part of building really great characters in your stories is understanding that they have their own entire backstory. And with the use of lessons from psychology, you can make those characters much more believable and vastly more interesting. And lastly, as part of each episode, I'm going to include tricks of the trade, which are a collection of usually 3 ideas to make your campaigns better, or things that you can incorporate into your campaigns. So with that brief introduction, let's get to the main topic. And today's topic is, why do we care about stories, or why do we react to stories in an emotional way? And really caring about the outcomes of stories and the journeys that the characters are taking, it's a term I refer to in my book as emotional connection to the story. And I consider the emotional connection that players have in my stories as the metric by which I measure how well I'm performing as a dungeon master. I know that if they don't care about the story, they won't have an emotional connection to it, and that usually means that I've done something wrong behind the screen. The reason I try so desperately to establish an emotional connection is there's something that takes place in the brain when you become emotionally invested in something. The primary emotion that players connect with when they are engaged with a story is empathy. And we know from scientific studies that empathy levels are much higher when there is an enhanced level of oxytocin. And oxytocin increases when we are emotionally attached to something that we're seeing or hearing. This is why when you watch a really sad movie or read a really sad story, it can cause you to cry because you have an emotional investment in the experience. You understand what the characters are experiencing. Your brain makes correlations to your own history, to your background, and pulls up similar feelings that the characters are experiencing that you have also experienced. And so you have a connection to those things. And there's a measurable level of oxytocin increase in your blood when that happens. But there's also another portion of that. In order to have that emotional connection, we have to be able to pay attention to something. And that happens mostly with the release of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. But it's also the hormone that activates when something excites us. So when we're watching a movie and it has scenes that are really captivating, that focus our attention in depth on what is taking place, that's when we are able to build an emotional connection, because first it is grabbing our attention, and then later it is allowing us to develop empathy for the characters in that story. So what this means for players around your table is that if you are able to hold their attention by making a interesting story that has enough action and drama and suspense to keep their attention focused on what is happening, empathy will develop as a part of that response. So ways that you can do this in your game: creating compelling stories. If a story is exciting, then it's going to be much more easy to pay attention to. Dynamic NPCs and relatable villains. These are both things that will help you. As a dungeon master, we want this emotional connection in our games because we want our characters to remember the games that we're running. We want them to remember the stories that we are telling. So we need to find ways to keep the story interesting to our players. First of all, it has to be unique. If your players are just running a cookie cutter sort of adventure that is the same as something they've done 100 times, it's going to fade into the background and it's not going to be memorable for them. But more importantly, it's not going to hold their attention and it's not going to cause them to have an emotional connection, which is what we want. This is how your stories are going to become the ones that they're always talking about for years to come. Other than being unique, it needs to be exciting. And I don't just mean that with combat. Yes, rolling the dice can be exciting and fights can be exciting, but they can also be tedious. So other than combat, you can make sure that your NPCs are unique. They're interesting to interact with. Each one should feel like they are their own individual. Once your world is dynamic and filled with NPCs who are each their own character, and your players enjoy interacting with those, or they really hate interacting with those, but they have to do it anyways, and it just sort of drives them crazy. Either way, it's going to grab their attention. So if you have a particularly annoying NPC that they have to keep going to, and it just keeps getting under their skin the way that this NPC keeps making them feel, that is just as effective sometimes as having one that's not so annoying. I do try and keep my annoying NPCs to sort of a minimum and my engaging NPCs to a much higher degree. But every now and then, it's always fun to throw in that NPC that just makes them go, oh my gosh, we have to deal with this guy again. And a third thing you can do is understand that your player's attention span on a single thing is only about 8 to 10 minutes long. So you need to keep things moving before attention is lost. Do not get dragged down in the minutia of your story. There are so many important things that are on plot you want your characters to experience, so don't make the off-plot points take up the majority of your gaming session. It won't be fun for anyone. So let's move on to my final segment, which I'd like to call Tricks of the Trade. This is where I'm going to give you 3 or roughly 3 ideas each week that can help make your campaign better. These can be plot hooks, they could be house rules, they can be story ideas, you name it. Anything that might add to your campaigns, and I'm going to try and keep them connected to the main topic each week. And because this week we were talking about emotional connection and attention spans, that is what my Tricks of the Trade will be focusing on. So the first idea, to keep attention focused on the game, try playing old school. Go back to a pencil and paper and dice game. Technology is awesome, but it's most awesome when it's used between sessions, not during sessions. Now, I know this might not be feasible. Some people use technology to game. They might Zoom, they might have somebody who phones in, or they might even use a hosted role-playing suite. But if you're playing with a tabletop group and you're all sitting around the player, then I would suggest a house rule that is technology-free or technology-light sessions. It's very possible that you might also use technology to do rules research, leveling up, and things like that, rather than the traditional paper books. But I would strongly suggest just trying to run a couple of sessions, very light or free of technology, and just see how much more attention span your players have to provide when they don't have so many distractions available to them. The second idea, this one's kind of fun. Try and make a villain that's very, very similar to the most noble character in your party. Like if you have a paladin, try to make a villain that is as close to a paladin as you can, but just sees things from a different angle. They can use many of the same phrases. They can use many of the same mannerisms. They can have the same fervor and drive for their passion, but just give it that slight twist. Give your characters, your players, the sense that this villain could have just as easily been a member of their party if they had made some slightly different choices. And the reason I suggest doing this is understanding villains makes your story more engaging. If your characters can understand a villain that you've made, not just who they are, where they live, and the bad stuff they did, but understand how they became the big, bad, evil guy, it's going to be far more engaging, and it's going to keep your players' attention more, because their brains will be processing how similar they are to this character. And really, so many of us are similar in ways that that differentiate between good and evil. This is why, on the both sides of the political spectrum, we can say the same things about each other in their villainy, right? The right will say the same things about the left as the left will say about the right, and both will point them as the evil party. But realistically, it's just different choices and putting their passion on different things. So you can make a character, an NPC, that's going to do that for the party. And I just love the idea of a paladin coming up against, your quintessential anti-paladin, but not in the same way that you're used to seeing. Not in the, they do everything bad and they're super evil. No, they're saying the exact same things. They're going about it in almost the same way. Their goal, or just the decisions they made along the way, made them be passionate about a different thing. But all in all, they're practically the same character. My third idea, and this is something I try and do in every game that I run, eliminate unnecessary descriptions. And I cannot stress this enough. Keep your descriptions, like room descriptions or dungeon descriptions, keep them simple and exciting, and don't rehash the same descriptions over and over again. They make your setting fade into the background. One way that I like to think about this is I think about how many scene transitions and shifting camera shots you see in a movie. You'll jump from shot to shot in the same conversation, always keeping the attention focusing so you're not hitting that limit of your attention span. This concept can also be used when you're eliminating unnecessary descriptions. You don't need to describe everything about every empty room that doesn't have a monster or something in it. Sure, it might have cool features, but just say those cool features. It keeps you from drowning in monotony and getting lost and losing your player's attention. So, for example, if your characters open an old larder, instead of giving a 2-paragraph description about all the moldy food and all the stuff in there, you can just say, this room looks like a larder where all the food has spoiled. Simple as that. You don't need to spend 5 minutes on a pre-written description of this room if there's nothing important about it. So that about wraps up everything for this pilot episode. Please subscribe to my podcast and get in touch with me if you like. Also check out my book, Session Zero, the DMG to Writing Great Campaigns in Any System. It's available on Amazon. And we'll see you next week. We'll be talking about plot hooks. Thank you so much for listening to the Dungeons, Dragons, and Psychology podcast. See you next session.